I thought the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe was just absurd on the surface of it. Wasn't worth my time even to check out. And so I thought it was a crutch for the weak. I thought it was something that people made up to make themselves feel better about dying.
Hi, everyone. This is Barbara. I'm from the little town of Riverside, New Jersey. I am a mother of 3 and a grandmother of 4, which is soon to be 5. I absolutely love listening to true life stories. So when I came upon Compelled, I was immediately hooked. I would often cry as I heard how God came alongside each person in their struggle or how he pursued them in their rebellion toward him. Listening to these stories is like swimming in the goodness of God, so I share them as often as I can. They will build your faith and encourage your heart. And if you're like me, you'll definitely enjoy today's episode.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Compelled, where we use gripping, immersive storytelling to bring to life Christian testimonies from the kingdom of God, told by the people compelled to live for Him. In our last episode, we heard from Anna Chatelain. Anna was deeply rooted in her Catholicism alongside her husband and 2 daughters. But Anna found herself searching for additional spiritual answers. But after finding those answers in the Bible and joyfully sharing them with her husband, Anna discovered that her husband didn't want anything to do with it. And if that was the case, how would Jesus want her to respond? Again, you can hear that story in our previous episode with Anna Chatelain. Today, our guest is Lee Strobel. Lee was a committed atheist and Pulitzer-nominated investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune. When his wife, of all people, became a Christian, Lee was disgusted and set out to prove her beliefs about Jesus to be untrue. But along the way, he was going to find more than he bargained for. So gather round, lean in, and join us for another compelling story from the kingdom of God. I first heard about Lee Strobel probably 20 years ago as a kid. We had one of his books on our family bookshelf, but beyond that, I didn't know too much more about him. But eventually, as an adult, I would learn about his story and the journey that he'd been on. And then when I realized that he lived only a few hours away from me in Texas, I reached out to him, and last spring we got together at his home. Lee was born in 1952 and grew up in a middle-class home in Chicago. His family enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, including visits to the country club where his father, an attorney, was a member. Even though they attended a Lutheran church, religion and faith was considered a personal choice for the kids, who had full freedom to decide their spiritual paths. And really, church was a matter of tradition rather than conviction. So religion, faith, and ultimately God took a backseat to another passion that Lee had, namely journalism.
I was always interested in journalism. When I was a little kid, when I was like 12 years old, I published a little neighborhood newspaper. I had advertisers in it. I made money at it.
Wow.
I would interview the police chief in our little town and the mayor and things like that. My most popular column, I had a column called Babysitter Guide. And it was all these local, high school kids who were willing to babysit. And of course, all the adults loved that. They bought my newspaper just to get the list of babysitters, because this was baby boom. Everybody was having babies and they were looking for babysitters. So I published that for about 2 years. And I always wanted to have a front row seat to history. It was the day after Christmas. I was in downtown Chicago, walking around with a friend of mine. And all of a sudden, from across the street, I see a guy from my neighborhood. And he says, "Hey, Strobel." Oh, what a coincidence that I would see a guy from my neighborhood because we lived in a distant suburb. And so I went over to say hi to him, and he was with a girl, and her name was Leslie. And they had met at a dance. And they had decided to come downtown and return some Christmas presents the day after Christmas and so forth.
And how old were you at this point?
We were both 14 years old, freshmen in high school. And she went home and told her mom, "I met the boy I'm going to marry." Her mom kind of patted her and said, "Oh, sure you have," And I went home and I would save up my dimes because I had two older brothers and I didn't want them to hear me on the phone talking to a girl because they just harassed me. So I would go up to a payphone at a gas station and put in the dimes in the payphone and call up Leslie and talk to her. And so we began our relationship very young. Neither of us could drive. We're just kids. And kind of, in a way, grew up together. I mean, she would take the train over to my suburb. We would walk around and, I mean, miles and miles and miles holding hands and just walking and talking.
As Lee and Leslie grew in their friendship and Lee honed his reporting skills, he began to notice something else, a growing tendency towards skepticism that crept into his personal life. And it felt natural to question everything around him.
The first time I ever called myself an atheist and consider myself an atheist was my freshman year of high school when I took biology and was taught that neo-Darwinism explains everything away, so you don't need God. And when I came to that realization and I realized God's out of business, you don't need him, and that really was the first time I called myself an atheist. And then the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe was just absurd on the surface of it. Wasn't worth my time even to check out. And so I thought it was a crutch for the weak. I thought it was something that people made up to make themselves feel better about dying. I tend to have a kind of a skeptical gear, So that tended to be my nature, to question things and to doubt things. And so that certainly was reflected in my spiritual perspective as well. And then I took basically 3 steps into atheism. First one was when I was in middle school, I was junior high, and I began asking the questions that junior high school kids ask, like, well, if there's a loving God, why is there so much suffering? Or if there's a loving God, how can he send people to hell? And I was basically told, don't ask those questions, just shut up, Because I'm in the school system, you don't talk about that stuff. And I thought, oh, I get it. They don't want to talk about this stuff because there are no good answers. And the second step happened in high school when I took biology, and I was taught that neo-Darwinism explains the origin and diversity of life. So God's out of a job. You don't need God if evolution is true. And then third step was when I went to the University of Missouri to study journalism, and I took a course on the historical Jesus that was taught by an atheist. And he convinced me that you can't trust what the Bible tells you about Jesus. And that cemented me really into my atheism.
One of the things that Lee disliked the most about Christians' belief in God was thinking about him as a loving father. That never resonated with him at all. In fact, Lee was the surprise addition to his family, and so his other siblings were much older. And whether he said it out loud or not, Lee's father was ready to be done with parenting when Lee came along. Lee always felt that his dad was absent and never sensed that he could please him. And this tension mostly played out in a neutral acknowledgement of the other's existence, until one day it boiled over.
I had a difficult relationship with my dad. And I was a difficult kid because I am a doubter. I am a skeptic. I don't take anybody's word for face value. I remember on the eve of my high school graduation, my dad and I had a big blow up over something I did that he told me not to do, and I did it anyway. And he looked at me and he said, I don't have enough love for you to fill my little finger. So I didn't go to my high school graduation. I walked out the door planning never to return home. So I think looking back, the relationship with my dad kind of opened the door toward atheism. I think I like to believe in my pride that I'm too smart, to be a Christian back then, and that it was my intellectual prowess that led me to doubt the existence of God. Well, you know what? I think the psychological dynamic of my relationship with my dad probably had a bigger impact than I like to admit. Paul Vitz, who was a professor of psychology at New York University, did a book called Faith of the Fatherless. He studied all the famous atheists of history, Camus, Sartre, Nietzsche, Freud, Voltaire, Wells, Feuerbach, O'Hare, and every single one of them he found had a father who either died when they were young, divorced their mother when they were young, or with whom they had a very problematic relationship. And the implication is you don't want to believe in a heavenly father if your earthly father has hurt you or abandoned you or disappointed you. And that's kind of a psychological factor that I think was nudging me toward the path of atheism. It's interesting. There's 2 trends in America that are very interesting to me. Number one, the increase in fatherless families. 40% of children in America these days are born into a fatherless family. And the second trend, the increase in skepticism toward God. The young people are more and more skeptical about the existence of God. I just think there's a connection there. Doesn't mean that everybody who has a bad relationship with their dad, or their dad dies when they're young, or divorces their mother when they were young, is going to become an atheist. But I think it can open the door, and I think it did in me.
Whether it was his intellect or unresolved pain from his own relationship with his dad, Lee closed the door entirely on the possibility of God. In the meantime, he masked some of the pain from his dad's rejection by deepening his relationship with Leslie.
She moved down to Missouri, where I was going to school at the University of Missouri, to be near me after high school. And she worked at a bank. So one day, back then, you'd call your parents like once a week maybe, because it was expensive back then. So I went over to her apartment. I said I should call my parents. So I called my mom, and I didn't have anything to really tell my mom. And so I said to my mom, Leslie and I are going to get married. And what I meant was someday, after college, because I thought my parents would never let me to get married in college. And so I meant someday we get married. My mom thought, oh, great. Oh, congratulations. That's wonderful. I'll see if I can get the country club for the reception. She hangs up the phone. And I turned to Leslie. I said, I think maybe we're getting married. And then the phone rings. It's her mother, and said, Lee's mother called and said, you're getting married. I'm so excited. So I said, I guess we're getting married. So we got married after my sophomore year in college. I was 20 and she was 19. And we were too young to drink champagne at our wedding. So we had champagne glasses at our wedding that were filled with milk.
After their wedding, Leslie worked at a bank while Lee finished his journalism degree. After graduating, he immediately got a job working for the Chicago Tribune, one of the largest and most prestigious newspapers in America. His bosses at the Tribune liked his work and eventually offered Lee a deal that he couldn't refuse.
I went to Yale Law School, got my Master of Studies in Law degree. I came back to the Tribune. I was named legal editor of the Tribune, which had huge responsibilities of covering major court cases to the Supreme Court and elsewhere, covering the legal profession and major trials, political corruption cases in Chicago and so forth. And so our daily circulation back when I was there was about 800,000 a day. On Sundays, it was about 1.2 million.
And you would even be nominated for like a Pulitzer at one point also, right? Because of that.
Yeah, I was nominated by the Tribune for the Pulitzer Prize and won the biggest award in Illinois by United Press International for investigative reporting. I broke a lot of the original stories on the Ford Pinto case, which you're probably too young to remember that. That was a huge story back then about the design of an automobile by the Ford Motor Company called the Ford Pinto, which had the tendency to blow up when hit from behind in low to moderate speed crashes. And about 65 people were burned to death in Pintos that should have walked away, but because of the bad design of the car, they were killed. And they were charged with homicide for 3 girls who were burned to death in the Pinto. It was the first time in American history that a corporation was charged, in a sense, with murder for the design of a product. And what happened was there had been some civil lawsuits, but this was the first criminal case. And I actually got a tip that there were some secret Ford documents in the public file of this court case. And so I went and I got those documents. Ford found out that I got the documents. They got a court order sealing the file, so I was the only one with these documents. And they documented that Ford knew in advance that this car had a tendency to blow up when hit from behind. And they didn't want to fix it because of the cost and the fact that you probably couldn't put golf clubs in the trunk if they redesigned it the way they needed to redesign it. So it was headlines all over the country. For 3 days, I had the biggest story in the country. It was front page of every newspaper in the land. So, I investigated stuff like that. Political corruption, corporate corruption, all kinds of things.
Amongst his bosses in the newsroom, Lee was a rising star. Hard-hitting, stubborn, and willing to get his hands dirty. But there was a cost to this success, namely kindness and morality. At the Chicago Tribune, Lee played the journalism game hard. He'd buddy up with court clerks to sneak a peek at hot files, and sometimes he'd even tuck a crucial document under his jacket to keep ahead of the competition. He had a knack for getting what he wanted, even if that meant bending the rules, like pretending to be part of the police to coax more info out of witnesses. He once went so far as to take a colleague's career just because the guy was in his way. The colleague ended up getting fired right in the middle of his honeymoon. Brutal, right? But that was Lee. He had no sense of right or wrong. After all, humans were just the product of primordial soup that had evolved into complex biological cells. There was no creator God and therefore no cosmic judge of right or wrong. Man was his own God, and Lee lived like it. But while Lee was excelling professionally, personally, his life was beginning to rip at the seams.
What they didn't see was the other side. And that was me literally drunk in the snow in an alley on Saturday night. I was a narcissist. I lived a very immoral life, in a way, a self-destructive life behind the scenes. I was not an alcoholic, but my hobby was getting drunk. In other words, I didn't have a chemical dependency on alcohol. It was just a hobby. I was the friendliest drunk in the bar. So I would go in, I would get drunk, I would get pitchers of beer, and I would go around filling everybody's glasses all night. And I remember the first night I ever drank, I was working at a newspaper while I was going to school, and I was on assignment in Ames, Iowa, doing something. And I had 12 Harvey Wallbangers in one night, which was a potent drink. And I woke up in a coffin, because it was Halloween, and I had stumbled into a sorority house where they had a Halloween display and an open coffin, and I had climbed into the coffin. And I woke up the next day in this coffin, which should have been a clue that this is probably not the best way to live your life. Yeah, I should have been smart enough to see that this is where this kind of lifestyle ends up. You know, I had a bad temper. I felt like, I never articulated this, but my attitude was, if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, if there is no judgment, if there is no ultimate accountability, then the most logical way to live life as a hedonist, just pursue pleasure, because what else is there? And that's what I did.
But it wasn't just his own life he was destroying. Lee and Leslie now had a family, and Lee's poor decision-making and uncontrollable temper began to get out of hand.
We had a little girl, Allison, and when she was a toddler, if she was playing with some toys in the living room, you know, some blocks or whatever, and she would hear me come home from work through the front door, her natural reaction was just to gather her toys and go in her room and shut the door. You know, is she going to be drunk again? Is she going to be yelling and screaming and swearing and literally kicking holes in the wall, which I would do out of rage? At least it was nice and quiet in her bedroom. So it was affecting our marriage. It was affecting our family, my children. My son was later born. But that was my life. You know, as long as I was successful in the eyes of the world, nobody was questioning anything. Nobody peered beneath the surface to ask how I was really doing, as long as I was professionally delivering what I was delivering.
Would you have classified yourself as happy?
Boy, that's a good question. Was I happy? No. I was frustrated and I was angry. And if you asked me back then, well, why are you so mad? Why the rage? I wouldn't have been able to tell you. But looking back now, I can see what it was, that I was always after the perfect high. You know, I was always after the ultimate experience of pleasure. But everything would let you down. Nothing lived up to the hype. And so I had a lot of rage in me. My wife and I one day getting into an argument, and our little daughter was there, and I had so much rage, I reared back and I kicked a hole right through our living room wall. And my wife's crying, our daughter's crying. It's like, I mean, that was just another day in the Strobel house. So no, I don't think I was happy. I think I was full of rage, full of anger, full of frustration over this lifestyle not delivering what I thought it should deliver. Because if you pursue pleasure, you'd think you'd find pleasure. And what I found is, no, you're more likely to find frustration. There were times when I would apologize, well, even after that incident with kicking the hole in the wall, you know, I would especially pull my daughter aside, say, I'm sorry, Daddy lost his temper, and don't be scared. And I would be contrite afterwards. But when you keep doing it, it kind of loses some of its credibility, right? There's only so many times you can apologize for your behavior until you realize, well, maybe I ought to change my behavior. But I was powerless to do it. I mean, if there is no God, there is no hope. There literally is no hope. There is no, we're not getting out of this alive. It's all dead ends. It's all dead ends.
While Lee was growing increasingly frustrated with his circumstances and dug deeper and deeper into his sinful desires, His wife Leslie was growing hopeless, yet she was on the brink of a change that would shake the very foundation of their marriage at its core. More on that after the break. Welcome back to Compelled. Lee Strobel was a hotshot journalist breaking big stories left and right. But behind the scenes, his life was a mess. He was battling alcohol, cynicism, and uncontrollable rage. It seemed like nothing would break Lee's cycle of anger and self-medication. But God had other plans, namely a new friend that Lee's wife Leslie was about to make.
Her name was Linda, and she was a Christian who was a nurse. She had a child the same age as our daughter. They were like just a few months apart, named Sarah. And she lived right downstairs in the same condo building. Well, they became best friends. And so Leslie would go over there during the day. Leslie was a full-time mom then. And they'd hang out, and they got into spiritual discussions. Linda would say to my wife, Leslie, she would say, well, how are you going to raise your children? You know, we live in a world with all kinds of, strange beliefs. And Leslie said, well, we're just going to let them decide on their own. And she said, really? I mean, it's kind of a big decision what you're going to believe about nature, about God, about things like that. And it got Leslie thinking about things. And she shared the gospel with Leslie. She invited her to church. Leslie went to church, which really made me mad because I was stuck at home babysitting the kids. And I said, enough of this. You're not going back. And so I discouraged her from going to church. But she would hang out with Linda, and Linda would answer her questions. And then one day, Leslie came up to me and said, I made a big decision. I've decided to become a follower of Jesus. And I first went through my mind was divorce. Oh no, she's going to turn into some, holy roller or something. I didn't sign up for this. This was not the deal when we got married. So I was going to walk out.
That literally went through your mind. Like,
oh yeah. I was done. In fact, I'll tell you, I usually don't say this because it's totally embarrassing, but I was so mad when she told me that it was time for me to cut the lawn. And she had just the day before planted this elaborate flower garden, spent all day planting flowers in the garden in the backyard. And so after she told me, I was so mad, I went out with the lawnmower and I mowed down her entire flower bed that she had spent the whole day planting. It was just...
You sound like a real jerk, man.
Yeah, I really was. It was a real jerky thing to do, but that was me. I mean, it's the only way I could express my disappointment and anger at the time. I was just in shock. I was just like, you got to be kidding me. Why would you believe that? Why would you have any reason to believe in fairy tales and mythology and make-believe and wishful thinking? That's what we're talking about here. It's wishful thinking. It's people who are afraid of dying, so they made up this idea of heaven and an afterlife to make themselves feel better about death. That's what this is all about. So I tried to talk her out of it, but she was adamant in her newfound faith. So we kind of tried to live as an unequally yoked couple. It was an era of arguments and conflict. And, all of a sudden, for the first time in our life, remember, we met at 14. So we grew up together. And now, all of a sudden, for the first time, our values were different. Our morality was different. Our attitudes were different. She had this Christian worldview. I had this atheistic worldview. We argued over everything. She wanted to give money to the church. I said, here's an idea. Why don't you take the money and flush it down the toilet? There you go. It's the same thing as giving it to the church. That's what I said to her. She actually got a part-time job so she could earn a paycheck so she could give money to the church because she felt if anybody's going to help me reach my husband, it's going to be the church. So I'm going to invest in this church.
For 2 years, Lee and Leslie barely hung on to their marriage. Leslie, who had found something real in her faith, kept nudging Lee to come to church with her, while Lee was certain they were headed for divorce. Yet at the same time, he couldn't ignore the changes in Leslie. She was different, kinder, more grounded, and had this new way about her that was hard to overlook. So one Sunday morning, with his head still throbbing from a hangover, Lee finally caved and joined her at church. But little did he know that decision would change everything.
I did finally, on January the 20th of 1980, I went to church with her for the first time. It was a church for the unchurched, meeting in a movie theater. And the pastor gave a sermon that was basically a gospel sermon. And it was the first time I understood the gospel. I don't want to say I've never heard it, because when I was a kid and dragged to this church, maybe I heard it, but I never got it. I never understood it. But here I am at this church, and I hear the gospel for the first time, and I go, wow, okay, at least I understand it now. Now I get what this is about. It's not about just trying to live a good life and hope you please this celestial being so that someday you'll spend eternity in heaven. It's not about that. It's about recognizing the fact that we're sinners, that we walked away from God, that we've violated his laws, and it's confessing that, it's turning from that, it's repenting from that, it's receiving Jesus as our forgiver and our leader. And then out of a relationship with God, our life changes. So the formula for faith is not Jesus plus good works equals eternal life. It's Jesus plus nothing equals eternal life plus good works. The good works flow out of a changed life. Well, it's the first time I understood that. And I walked out that day seeing two things. Number one, I didn't believe it. I get it. I just didn't believe it. But number two, I realized if this is true, this has huge implications for my life. And so that's the day I decided to take my journalism training and legal training and investigate this, because I realized this is an historical religion. This religion, unlike many others, makes certain claims about history, that there was someone named Jesus, that he supposedly was born of a virgin, that he lived this life where he performed miracles and exorcisms, that he died and then 3 days later returned from the dead. Those are historical claims that I could investigate. This is what I did as an investigative reporter. I investigated things. So I thought, I can dig my fingers into this. This is not some ethereal, philosophical question about God and about the universe. No. This is stuff you can touch. This is history. So I thought I can use my training to really delve into this. And that's what prompted me to begin my investigation. So how did I do it? Well, I read books, got every book I could find. Back then, this is before the internet. This is before Amazon. It was not very easy. There weren't a lot of popular level books on the evidence for the faith back then, but there were some. There were some books on apologetics or evidence for the faith, not a lot, but I read those. I remember going to the library and filling out an interlibrary loan for a book that was published in the 1800s by a famous lawyer who helped found Harvard Law School, who was a skeptic who became a believer. His name was Simon Greenleaf. And he wrote a book on the evidence for Christianity. And it took about 6 months for them to find a copy of that book. And I got it, read it, and that was very interesting stuff. I remember going into a library and looking, back then it was microfiche and microfilm, and finding old copies of articles that had been written in various journals about evidence for the faith. I would pick up the phone. I remember there was one scholar I found who was an expert on the early church fathers. And I was interested in one of those early church fathers because supposedly he had a relationship with one of the disciples, and the disciple had told him about encountering the risen Jesus and so forth. So I wanted to investigate that. So I just call him up, because that's what I did as a reporter. So I call him up. Hi, I'm Lee Strobel from the Chicago Tribune. Well, he probably thought I was working on an article. I let him think that.
Because then they talk forever, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I interviewed him, about tell me about Ignatius and tell me his story and what do you know about him? And I don't believe this guy was a believer, but he was a scholar, and that's what I was after. So it was a lot of books. It was a lot of articles. It was a lot of picking up the phone and interviewing people or questioning people. And I did that for 1 year and 9 months. I remember one day, it was November the 8th of 1981. And I realized that day, this is after 1 year and 9 months of investigating this stuff. And I said to myself, a good juror reaches a verdict. And I think the evidence is in after 1 year and 9 months. I think I've kind of plumbed it as deeply as I can plumb it. So I sat down with all the documents I'd gathered and all the books that I'd gathered and notes that I'd written over this 1 year and 9 months. And I kind of reviewed it all. And then I sat back and I said, wait a second. In light of this avalanche of evidence that points so powerfully toward the truth of Christianity, I realized it would take more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. In other words, the scales just shifted. dramatically at that moment. And I realized that based on the historical data concerning the resurrection of Jesus, which I realized was the key to everything, because if Jesus, he clearly claimed implicitly and explicitly to be the Son of God. But so what? I could claim to be God. You could claim, anybody can claim that. But if he died, and then 3 days later, as he predicted, he returns from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth. I just came to the conclusion that I cannot turn my back on this, that I believe based on the data that Jesus is who he claimed to be. Now, I looked at other things too. I looked at science. I looked at cosmology. I looked at physics. I looked at biochemistry. I looked at other things. I looked at philosophy, the moral argument, and so forth. I looked at all that. But to me, because I could dig my fingers into it, the history, the resurrection, it's a very simple thing. Did Jesus live? Was he dead? Was he reliably encountered afterwards? 3 simple things to look at. Did he live? You know, there's a group out there these days called mythicists who claim that Jesus never really existed. He was a myth. He never really existed. And so Bart Ehrman, who is one of the most famous agnostics in America, a professor of religion and so forth, very highly educated, highly trained, skeptic about faith, non-believer, he did a book on this mythicist question and said, whether you like it or not, Jesus existed. He was a real person. So did Jesus exist? Yes. Was he killed? Well, even the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a peer-reviewed scientific medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus. And their conclusion was clearly the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. So did he live? Yes. Was he dead? Yes. Was he reliably encountered afterwards? We have 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus. That is an avalanche of historical data. And the earliest record dates back to within months of his death, far too quick to be a myth. So I think the evidence is overwhelming. And to me, that was persuasive. That was the key to the whole thing. And so I kind of did things a little bit backwards because a lot of people who are atheists who become believers first look at the question, does God exist? And then, is Jesus his unique son? I kind of went the other way. If Jesus is who he claimed to be, he's a unique son of God, therefore God exists. So I just kind of took my own pathway. And I remember when I got to that position, when I realized this is true. Jesus is the unique Son of God. And then my next thought was, am I done? Was that it? I was kind of let down because I thought, 2 years I investigated this and I've concluded, yes, Jesus is who he claimed to be. What do I do? Is that it?
Lee had finally reached a verdict. But when he first started his investigation 2 years prior, his only plan had been to debunk Christianity. And with that option now off the table, Lee was in for a surprise. Coming up after the break. Welcome back to Compelled. Lee Strobel set out on a 2-year investigation to disprove the claims of Jesus Christ and validate his own atheism. But now Lee had his answers. Yes, Jesus existed. Yes, he was killed and declared dead. And yes, there was credible eyewitness testimony of encountering the risen Jesus. Lee had set out to disprove everything, but now that the evidence all pointed the opposite direction, he didn't know what to do. So finally, he turned to his wife, Leslie, who told him that there was more to the story than evidence alone.
Leslie pointed out a verse to me, John 1:12. Says, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And I looked at that verse and I noticed it forms an equation of what it means to become a child of God. Believe plus receive equals become. So I believed, based on the evidence, that Jesus is the unique Son of God, that God is real, God exists. I believed it based on the data. That wasn't enough. I had to receive. Receive what? Receive this free gift of God's grace, this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life. And when I would receive that free gift and a prayer of repentance and faith, then I would become a child of God. And so I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received complete and total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God. And I'll never forget, Leslie burst into tears, and she threw her arms around my neck, and she's crying. And she said, I almost gave up on you 1,000 times. She said, you know, when I was a new Christian, I went to church and I met some women and I told them about you. I said, I don't have any hope for my husband. He is the hard-hearted, hard-headed legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. He's never going to bend his knee to Jesus. And this one elderly saint named Sylvia put her arm around Leslie's shoulder, kind of pulled her to the side. And she said, oh, Leslie, no one is beyond hope. And she gave her a verse from the Old Testament, Ezekiel 36:26. It says, moreover, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit within you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And so this whole time, this 2 years that I'm on this investigative journey, checking all this stuff out, what I never knew at that time, every day, on her own, in private, on her knees, my wife was praying that prayer for me. She prayed that verse for me every single day. And God, on November the 8th of 1981, when I prayed a prayer of repentance and faith to receive this free gift of grace, when that happened, and in the succeeding months after that, she began to see God answered her prayer because my values changed and my character changed and my morality changed and my worldview and my philosophy and my parenting and my attitudes. I mean, my whole life, my whole perspective, my whole worldview began to change for the good. That was the pivotal moment in my life.
God's grace got a hold of Lee, and it started showing up in every part of his life. The solid evidence he found for Christ's claims was like a key unlocking his faith. But there was still a large hurdle for Lee, his past. And Lee was worried that his previous behavior was standing in the way of someone else's faith, his daughter, Allison.
All she had known the first 5 years of her life was a dad who was absent, angry, kicking holes in walls, coming home drunk. That was her whole life experience. But starting on that Sunday afternoon that I gave my life to Christ, she started to watch. Something's changing with my dad. Something's different with my dad. Something's new with my dad. Never interviewed a scholar, never studied archaeology. She's just a little kid. But she could watch, she could listen, she could learn. And she did. And it took about 4 or 5 months. And it was a Sunday morning. And she first went up to her Sunday school teacher and then up to Leslie. And she said, I want God to do for me what he's done for Daddy. That was the day at age 5 that she received this free gift of God's grace and became a child of God. It's just exciting to see how God he rescued our family. I mean, you think about it. If I had stayed on the course I was on, what would have been the outcome? We wouldn't have stayed married. I would have blown our marriage apart at some point. I mean, it was just a dead end of drinking and carousing, and God rescued our family. He saved our family. So that was probably the first miracle of our life together, is to see the difference God made in our children and in our lives.
After Lee turned to Christianity, he still had a passion for journalism, but was unsure of whether or not his new way of life was still compatible with how he used to work at the Chicago Tribune. He and Leslie began praying for what would come next, and eventually, Lee felt called to run his own paper. God opened a door for him to take over the Columbia Daily Tribune in Missouri, and there, Lee tackled the job with a goal to lead the paper like Jesus would, full of integrity and a servant's heart. But after some years, Lee and Leslie felt drawn back to their old church community in Chicago, where they had first followed Jesus, which is where God revealed the next step of his bigger plan.
We ended up going back to Chicago, where I was assistant managing editor of the third largest newspaper in the state. And I began to feel called into ministry. one of the surprising things about that was my father-in-law, Leslie's dad, who was an atheist. I went to tell him that I was going to leave and take a position on the staff of a church at a 60% pay cut. And I thought he's going to be mad because he's an atheist. And oh my gosh, what am I doing with his daughter and her family? And so I told him, and he looked at me and he said, Lee, if you feel like that's what you should do, you ought to do it. Isn't that funny? And a lot of Christians in my life said, oh, I don't know, 60%. How are you going to support your family? How are you going to put your kids through college? They were raising red flags, and this atheist father-in-law said, go for it. Not because he thought God told me, but because he could see that was a desire of my heart.
Over time, Lee served as a pastor for several years in Illinois, California, and Texas. He had a passion for evangelism, and in 1998, he published The Case for Christ, a book detailing the research he did into Christianity and his journey from a skeptical atheist to a born-again Christian. The book eventually sold millions of copies and is often cited as a must-read for anyone exploring the claims of Christianity. And while Lee cared about bringing the gospel to all people, he had a special heart for atheists, people just like him who believed that God never existed and was just a figment of our imaginations. One atheist who weighed on his heart in particular was his father-in-law, Leslie's dad. Lee and Leslie had shared the gospel with him many times, but with no success. But then in 2006, Lee tried one last time.
He had a stroke. They sent him home to die, basically. They said he was going to have a series of further strokes and die. And so I sent, his wife was a believer, and I sent her and Leslie out one day, and I said, give me one more shot at Al. So I sat next to Al's chair where he was in this recliner dying, and I said, Al, you know you're dying, right? I said, I don't want to be in heaven without you. Your daughter, your wife, your grandchildren. We don't want to be in heaven without you. Al, please. I began to beseech him and to reason with him and try everything. And I actually uttered under my breath, Satan, let him go. I just felt like Satan had his claw on his foot and was going to drag him to hell. So I shared the gospel with him and reasoned with him and gave him evidence for the faith for about 45 minutes. And then finally I looked at him and I could see his countenance was changing. And I said, Al, you want to receive Jesus right now, don't you? And he had tears in his eyes. And he said, yeah, I do. And so he prayed a prayer of repentance and faith at age 87 after a lifetime of atheism and received Christ as his forgiver and leader. And then Leslie and Al's wife came home, and I told them the news, and we began to celebrate, and they're making dinner. And then we realized Al was going numb on one side. He was having another stroke. So we called an ambulance. He gets in the ambulance with Leslie. I'm following in the car. The ambulance gets to the hospital. They put him on a gurney. They're wheeling him into the emergency room. And he looks up at Leslie and he says, tell Lee thanks. And they wheel him into the emergency room, and that stroke destroyed his mind. And he lingered for a while, and then he died. The last cogent conversation of his life, he came to faith in Christ, and we will spend eternity in heaven with him. That is how deep the grace of God is.
As our conversation came to a close, there was still one question on my mind. Did Lee ever reconcile with his own dad?
That's a good question. Not in the way that I hope someday we will. What I mean by that is I walked out of the house that day after he told me he didn't have enough love for me to film his little finger. And my intention was never to go home again. And I moved away. Here I am, 18 years old, just graduated from high school, moved away to an apartment in a little town called Woodstock, Illinois, where I worked at a newspaper over the summer. My mom finally convinced me to return home briefly before I went off to college. And so my dad and I had kind of a tepid relationship. We never talked about our relationship. We never dealt with it. We just had kind of a cool relationship. And then he died at age 64. He was pretty young. it was interesting because I came to the wake. I'm sitting there, and these people started to come up to me who I didn't know, friends of my dad's. And they would say, "Are you Lee?" And I'd say, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, man, your dad never stopped talking about you. Oh, he was so proud of you when you had a byline, the front page of the Chicago Tribune. His buttons were bursting. And then when you went to Yale Law School, and he was so proud of you." One after the other. And I thought, this is weird. We never talked about these things. And so finally I asked for the place to be emptied. And I stood in front of my dad's coffin. And I just said to him, "I'm sorry." Because I was sorry for things I had done. I was not innocent in this whole thing. I was a trouble kid that pushed all his buttons and, So I said to the corpse of my father, "I'm sorry." I just wrote a book called The Case for Heaven. And while I was interviewing the theologian Scott McKnight for that book, he said something interesting to me. He said, "I believe the first 15 minutes of heaven, or the first hour in heaven, we're going to be reconciling with other Christians who, we all die in this world, and we may not be in perfect relationship with every Christian we know. And yet we're going to spend eternity in heaven with them." And he said, "I believe the first 15 minutes of heaven, we're all going to be so motivated to fully reconcile with other Christians who we maybe had some problems with in this world. And I believe my dad is in heaven. I believe he was a believer. And I believe that when I get to heaven, that first 15 minutes, I'm motivated to reconcile. He's motivated to reconcile. We're going to hug and we're going to cry, and we will then have all of eternity to have the kind of father-son relationship that we didn't really enjoy in this world."
Yeah. Lee, thank you for your time and for sharing your story here.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
What stands out to me from Lee's story is the incredible power of the truth of the gospel to transform even the most skeptical. Lee set out to debunk Christianity using his investigative journalism skills, but when he found the evidence to so overwhelmingly point back to the truth of the gospel, he still had to make a choice. Would he respond in faith? Merely knowing about Christ or believing that Jesus was real or even divine was not enough. Even the demons know that Jesus is real and the Son of God. Rather, receiving Christ entailed repenting and asking for the forgiveness of sins and embracing Jesus as the Lord of his life. It reminds me of the parable of the sower from the Gospel of Matthew. Much like the seeds that fell on good soil, the truth about Christ finally found fertile ground in Lee's heart after years of skepticism. This seed not only sprouted, but flourished, producing a harvest beyond what Lee or Leslie could have ever imagined. It's a reminder that sometimes even the most resistant hearts can become rich soil for faith. Today, Lee is a best-selling author with over 40 books. He's also the founding director of the Lee Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics at Colorado Christian University. Lee and Leslie have now been married for over 50 years, and their story was dramatized into a movie called, appropriately, The Case for Christ. I've seen it, and it's a great film. We'll include links to the movie and several of Lee's books on our website, compelledpodcast.com. Just search for this episode, and you'll see it in the show notes. Also, we're giving away 2 autographed copies of Lee's book, The Case for Faith, a deep dive into some of the toughest objections about Christianity. You can enter the drawing in our show notes. Again, just visit compelledpodcast.com and search for this episode. Also, Lee would appreciate your prayers. Just a few weeks ago, while we were working on this episode, Lee had a health scare. So please pray that he and his doctors would be able to get accurate test results and make wise decisions. And if you know someone who would be blessed by Lee's testimony, maybe a friend or a family member or your church small group, then please just take 30 seconds and send this to them. And if you'd like to help us create more stories just like this one, then join Compelled as a monthly partner and get early access to every episode 1 week early ahead of time, ad-free, as well as all of our behind-the-scenes interviews. That's over 100 hours of additional content. Get started at compelledpodcast.com/donate. Today's story was edited by Will Jackson, story editing by Atlee Nugent, sound engineering by Zach Thaler, and our associate producer is my wonderful wife, Sarah Hastings. Stay tuned for a sneak peek from our next story, an encore episode with Jim Payne that we'll be releasing on Memorial Day. In 2005, Jim deployed to the Middle East as part of a Navy SEAL platoon alongside 15 of his closest friends and brothers in arms. Partway during their deployment, his team suffered devastating losses in the mountains of Afghanistan in an incident detailed in the best-selling book and hit movie Lone Survivor. As Jim grappled with crippling grief, it was all that he could do to cling to the one who could offer any glimmer of hope. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and you've been listening to Compelled. We'll be back with another compelling story 2 weeks from now. We'll see you then.
And so they drop us off right at sun setting. Idea is to get over there in 6 hours. Anyway, a storm brewed up pretty bad, and our support ship that was watching us had to take off. It was getting so bad. And we call it the perfect storm because we were doing troughs like this in Zodiacs. And then we had Zodiac engines dying, and Dan was puking, and the pontoons were deflating on us out there. So we had a comedy of errors was going on.
And your support ship's gone also, which is
support,
not
it took
good.
off, yeah. So we had no comms with anybody. In fact, the guy across from me, he's probably about 6'5". You know, he's a big guy, big SEAL. But when we were going down the trough like this, I never saw his eyes get so big as I saw him then.